Hey there, and welcome to Into the Terminal episode 25. Today, we're going to be talking about third party repositories, things like EPEL, RPM Fusion. But before I do, I must introduce the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Scott McBrien.
Good morning, Eric.
Morning. All right, let's dive in. So the most common and well known third party repository when it comes to Red Hat Enterprise Linux that I can think of is EPEL. So a lot of times this extra Linux packages repository, and I flip those words around, are a way to get additional packages that may not be included in the official Red Hat Enterprise Linux image. So let's go ahead and get EPEL configured. So inside slash etsy slash yum.repos.d is where our configuration files are going to go. So we can actually install a release package that auto-populates that file, and that's what our command is here. We're going to do a DNF install on a remote package out on the Fedora project, because that's where EPEL lives, is out on the Fedora project website. So we're going to go ahead and install the latest EPEL release package, and once we do that, we'll be able to see where we'll be able to take a look at that yum configuration file. So now you see we've got a few EPEL packages, from EPEL testing um, to the actual EPEL.repo file. We'll dive into that. Actually, let's go ahead and take a look. Let's do a vim on that EPEL.repo file. And there's multiple different repositories actually configured, and there's not multiple, or there's only one of them is enabled, and that's the one here at the top. So about 4 or 5 lines down, you'll see an enabled equals 1. Go figure. That means that the repository is actually enabled. It also has some configuration information like base URL versus metalink. We'll talk about that in the second half of the show. But it gives us a friendly name, enabled. We want our GPG checks to be enabled as well, because that tells us that allows us to do a check to make sure that the configuration file is actually, or the package that we're installing is actually the package we think. And so we'll get into a little bit more detail in the bottom half of the show. But if we do a list available on our packages, we should now see some RHEL 8, some RHEL 8 AppStream, but we should also see some EPEL packages as well. So right now it's pulling down all the metadata for the EPEL packages and the EPEL modular packages, which can take a few seconds to come back. But it's basically building an inventory of all the packages that are available. So you notice that towards the end of the column there's designates EPEL, and there's also some RHEL 8 packages in there. But as we kind of skim through here, you'll notice several packages included in EPEL now. And last but not least, in the top half of the show is let's go ahead and install a package from the EPEL repository. And one of my favorites is HTOP, which is a terminal-based, basically a terminal-based graphic of the top command, as well as actually a few other things. And that allows us to see the status of our system's resources, see what the most active processes are on our system. It's not an official Red Hat Enterprise Linux package, but it is out in EPEL. So now we can run the htop command and get a look at what our system's actually doing. So extra bit of information there. Scott, before we transition over, anything you'd like to add? I kind of blew right through that.
No, I'm looking forward to going into a little bit deeper dive after the transition.
All right, let's do it. All right, so we've got EPEL, but EPEL's not the only one. It's by far the most popular, but do we want to start with a little bit deeper dive into the configuration file? Then we could write one of our own, in fact.
So, yes, but I did want to point out a couple things about EPEL before we carry on.
Sure.
So Eric mentioned in the first part of the show that EPEL is for the extra packages for Enterprise Linux. And a lot of other Linux distributions will include community content with them, um, in such a way that, like, at the install time, it is part of the software configuration for that Linux. Red Hat Enterprise Linux, however, does not. We have you opt in to that community content by installing additional repos like EPEL. And the reason we do that is we want to be very clear about, like, what comes from Red Hat and what is not coming from Red Hat. So the only way you can get stuff that's not from Red Hat is by explicitly going out and adding repositories like we did with EPEL, so that we know we're not getting those packages from Red Hat. So a lot of the comments that I see from people transitioning or experiencing Red Hat Enterprise Linux for the first time is like, how come there's not a very much software? And it's not that there's not very much software, it's that other people add on all these community repos by default. So you're still getting roughly the same amount of software from your OS vendor, but what you're not seeing automatically is all this community stuff that gets bolted on. And so EPEL has something like, what, 4,000 packages for RHEL 8. It's got like 3,000, I think, for RHEL 9 already, which, oh, by the way, was released yesterday.
Yep.
And yeah, so like there's a lot more software options available for RHEL. It's just not turned on and installed by default.
Right.
All right,
That's a
so
great point.
one of my first questions, Eric, is like, we yum installed or DNF installed that URL to install EPEL. Where do we find that?
I don't think I understand the question.
How did we know that that was that huge string of URL stuff was what we should use?
Oh, okay, I gotcha. Well, to be honest, I just go out and Google Apple release package. It usually brings up the Fedora repository. Uh,
Right. And so I did just that Google. I looked for Apple release, and let me show you what page comes back as the top hit. Right, so the extra packages for Enterprise Linux is maintained by Fedora. You can see down here in the quick start, you can click to the version of Enterprise Linux you're interested in. Our VM today is running 8, so I clicked on 8.
we already
And
got called out for not running 9.
I mean, it's been a day. Um, but notice that right here, right, we literally just like took this and pasted it on a machine. That's how we got those repository definitions. And I know that in a little bit, we're going to take a look at how to add repos by hand. But the more established repositories have one of these RPMs that will install the repo configuration files for you.
And it's really helpful, especially considering that it gives you all the configurations, downloads the GPG keys, part of the RPM package. It makes configuration much easier than doing so by hand. In fact, I think that's a good point to dive into. How do we add custom repositories? Some if you're developing a piece of software in house, you might have a custom repository that's hosted out on a RHEL server. So you could do that. You could build a repository on just about any server, really. So why don't we go ahead and one of the after EPEL, usually the next custom repository I install, at least on my workstations, is Google Chrome, and Google has their own custom repository to install the Chrome browser. So if we go back into our yum.repos.d, and don't be confused, yum.repos works for DNF just the same as it has for yum all these years. So let's go ahead and let's create a google-chrome.repo configuration file. Any yum configuration needs to have that .repo in order for the service to recognize it as a configuration file. So now that we're in our blank file, let's start with we need to start with a repository designation, I suppose, not to be confused with a repository name. So the first is more the system related name, whereas the name column or the name option is designed to be more human readable. So we'll give it an obvious name like Google Chrome, Google Chrome packages, and then next up is we want to be able to have a base URL, and that is where the actual repository lives. And so this one can be a bit confusing, so it's easy to copy and paste from the configuration options, like the EPEL repository that we looked at. We mentioned enabled. So we can actually do the configuration and disable a repository if we're only interested in base OS packages, something along those lines. So if we turn that 1 to a 0, it'll actually disable the repository, so it won't pull any packages. And then one thing I want to talk about a little bit is this GPG key. I mentioned very quickly. I mentioned quickly that this is help to make sure that you're getting the package from the people you expect. But Scott, do you want to dive a little bit more into what the GPG signing process looks like and why this is important?
Sure. So GPG is GNU Privacy Guard. It's an asymmetric encryption implementation that allows for verification of identity mostly. So there's a couple different ways that you can use it. One is to encrypt things with someone's public key, and you send it to them, and then they can decrypt it with their private key. But what we use for package signing is the opposite. The packager signs the package with their private key, which can only be validated with the public key. And so what we're looking at here is when Google creates this package, they'll sign it with their private GPG key, and we are referencing what the public key is, and Yum and DNF have in their normal operating procedure that they will validate that signature. So if we don't tell it what key to use, then the validation is going to fail because it doesn't know how to resolve that validation request. So when you use GPG check, you also need to tell it where the public key for that GPG signature is stored. And here we're pointing it at a URL where it can download the signature. In other places, it'll reference a locally stored key. I think that's what we do for the Red Hat repos, for example. And all we're doing there is just making sure that when we download the package, that it came from someone that we trust by validating against the key that we got from the person that we trust. So in the case of Red Hat, we download those public keys from Red Hat. In fact, they're installed on your system as part of the base operating system install. For like EPEL, we get the Fedora key as part of our repo definition, and here we're doing it with Google.
And the other thing we talked about circling back to was this base URL. The base URL is just that. It is a direct URL link to the repository itself, where the actual packages live. In fact, there's a variable on the end of that line that points to our base architecture. So whether that's 64 bits or 32 bits in some cases, among a few others, but that's what that $ base arch is. But there's also this concept of a meta URL, uh, of a meta link, I think is the actual name. But I think of this more as almost like a symlink to what could be a series of mirrors. Does that ring true for you, Scott?
So for base URL, we're actually telling it like exactly the box we want to contact to find the repository information and packages. Some of the others allow us to substitute an additional lookup to be redirected to a mirror. So we use that a lot in the community repos because they're mirrored across a whole bunch of different servers across the world. People volunteer as part of the community to become a mirror for the packages. And so instead of base URL, I think I don't remember what the keyword is. We can probably look in the EPEL file and see it. Um, but it basically is so we know that we need to do a lookup to get a mirror, and that it's okay that that mirror name can change over time. Um, whereas with base URL, we're telling it exactly where to go.
Funny enough, I was looking on my workstation here, and I actually don't have Apple configured. I'll track that. I'll track that keyword down here in just a second. So with this, we have the bare minimum that we need in order to enable and to communicate um, with the Google Chrome repository that we just configured. Um, so you can tell how many opportunities you have of mistyping something. So when you have the opportunity to install a excuse me, an EPEL release, or a package like an EPEL release package, where everything comes pre-configured, it's much easier. Um, excuse me. Um, so now, let's see what all repositories we have on our system by doing a DNF repo list. And so our Google Chrome and our EPEL and a few others should appear. And sure enough, we've got some from GCP, we've got EPEL that we installed earlier, and now we've got a couple of new ones from Google Chrome, which was the one we just configured by hand. Uh, so why don't we go ahead and install Google Chrome? So it's going to go ahead and pull down all the metadata information like EPEL did before, and we'll see that it's going to install some font packages. It's going to pull in a few libraries, but right there at the top, sure enough, Google Chrome stable. And when we hit return here, we'll actually have the Chrome browser available on our local system.
Yeah, and I just wanted to point out, if we look at this dependency list, Um, Google Chrome is coming from the Google Chrome repository over here on the side that we created, right? But then all these dependencies that are being pulled in to support Google Chrome, that's coming from my Red Hat provided RHEL packages. So when you add a third party repository, all the packages in there are able to resolve dependencies across all of the other repositories. So if you're installing something from a third party repo and it needs something from RHEL, it can pull that package in. If it needs things from its own third-party dependencies, it'll pull those in. So that automatic dependency resolution is really nice.
Yeah, I remember the days before this was really fleshed out, where you get stuck in this dependency loop of I need this package, which is coming from this repository, and then but now it needs a dependency from this other package, and there's a mismatch, and it was great fun.
Yeah, and you can see here, it's asking us to import that GPG key that we referenced earlier. And that will validate the packages we download from Google against their signing key to make sure that something didn't happen either in transit or on the server where either the download was corrupted or something was replaced in the middle of the download with something else. All right, so oops. So this machine is running in non-graphical mode, so Google Chrome's not going to be super helpful on this box, but you can see that it's there as an executable, and we could run it, and things would execute anyway.
If you have any questions about third party packages, how that looks from a maintenance standpoint, be sure to add it to our chat. We also have a matrix room, and we're also present on a Red Hat subreddit. Sorry, my daughter wanted to come say hi. Anyway, but there's one other thing we wanted to talk about this morning, and that was another fairly popular third party repository called RPM Fusion. And this is one I've tangentially had experience with, uh, but it's not quite EPEL and it's not quite official. Um, so why don't we dive into what that is, and how that fits into kind of the larger ecosystem of community repositories?
Yeah, so RPM Fusion is actually a mixing of several historic repositories that people put together in the community for Red Hat Enterprise Linux related packages. Um, So it is a very rich ecosystem of additional packages. And I think what's most interesting about it is they will include non-open source stuff in their repositories. So if you need something like a codec for an audio or video player that is not open sourced, um, Red Hat's policy is we only ship open source software with few exception. Um, Same thing with EPEL. EPEL will only ship open source software, period, full stop. So if you need those additional packages, RPM Fusion is a great place to look for them. Um, One of the other tenets of these third-party repositories is EPEL will only complement RHEL packages. It will not replace any package that comes with Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And that's actually one of the packager guidelines that is required to be met in order to have packages added to EPEL, is it will not replace any Red Hat provided package as a dependency or anything else. That is not always the case for third-party repositories. So realize that if a third-party repository overwrites or installs a newer version of something that was originally provided by Red Hat, but now is provided by that third-party repository as a newer or increased version, you're now using community software for that component, which can lead to some interesting um, package dependencies, especially if you've maybe disabled that repository over time, because now in order to update things, we may need an additional package from that repository that we can't find anymore. So RPM Fusion is great. I've used it for a number of years. In fact, I used to use the selection of several of the component repositories that were used to fuse together into RPM Fusion. But that's another great place to look for software, especially non-open source software.
Skimming through the chat here, we've got, of course, a few people poking fun that we're using RHEL 8 today, but I'm not seeing any questions. Anything else you'd like to add, Scott?
Just don't forget to like if you enjoy this content and you want us to keep making it. If you think someone would be interested in this style of content, please feel free to share it. Also, Eric, we did a deeper dive on EPEL with Carl George a while ago on our your other show, Red Hat Enterprise Linux Presents. So, if folks want to get in more depth about what EPEL is and how it's built and a variety of other things, that's a great resource.
Yeah, we got in a lot deeper on kind of the ecosystem, what it looks like from a community perspective, and even talked about how do you become a package maintainer. So a lot of good information. We'll make sure to have the link to that episode in the show notes. Um, that was weird. Um, um, and then I think the other thing will mention before we wrap today is that next week we'll be talking about Red Hat Insights, which is included in your Red Hat Enterprise Linux subscription. And that's a great point. We may revisit this topic in a future episode and talk about error messages and how you'd go about resolving dependency issues. So that's a great point. I'll make sure to add that to our list. We have, I think, through episode like 40 something planned out, so we've got plenty of topics, but keep them coming because the more topics we have in the hopper, the easier it is to keep making content. So by all means, post in the comments, reach out to us on Twitter or on Matrix or anywhere else that Red Hat can be found, and submit your show ideas. Um, but with that, I think we can call it a day. Definitely join Scott tonight for dark mode to see this content again without my long-winded ramblings. And but other than that, Scott, we'll see you next time.